No, we'll go with, and maybe I'll just make a note that we, don't have a quorum, so, we're not taking any official action or anything at this meeting, but this will just be for update purposes on the
How many
Shoreland.
members do we have now?
What's that?
How many members do we have?
9.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and call the meeting of the Lakes and Water Quality Committee to order for Thursday, September 10, 2020. Let's do a roll call since we're a little short. If we just want to go around the table and do an informal roll call, do you want to start?
Sure. Randall Giroux.
Ann Helsher, Lake Minnetonka.
Lance Fisher, large.
DeCauley, Lake Zumbrasani.
Great, thank you. Next on our agenda is to adopt the formal agenda. Do I have a motion to adopt the final agenda as submitted?
I'll move we adopt the agenda.
Second? We have a motion and a second. All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Number 2, approval of minutes of the Lake and Water Quality Advisory Committee meeting of July 16, 2020. If you've had an opportunity to review the minutes, does anyone have any changes or questions about the minutes?
No.
Seeing none, do we have a motion to approve the minutes? I will make a motion to approve the minutes. Second?
I'll second.
All right. A motion and a second. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Any abstentions? Great. Item number 3, the Shoreland Management Ordinance discussion. I assume staff will lead us through this discussion?
Yes, Chair, committee members, thank you. Marty Dahl, Community and Economic Development Director for the city. As Chair Holscher alluded to, we are a little short on members today, so we are still not entirely sure if we are constituting a quorum or not, but because we don't have any official action that needs to be taken at this meeting, and this is really just an update of where we are at in this process, we'll go ahead and continue and provide that information and clarify the semantics of the meeting after the fact. But thank you for those who were able to join us tonight. So as you know, we have for several months and actually for several years been working on updating the Shoreland Management Ordinance. We've had a number of rounds of discussion with this group, with our planning commission. We've brought it and had some informal discussion with our city council in a workshop. Have had several rounds of back and forth with the DNR. We've gotten feedback from the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District. So I've done a very thorough process, I think, in working on crafting an ordinance that is based off the DNR's model shoreland ordinance, but that also provides some flexibility that is relevant and beneficial to the city of Victoria. We are very close to getting this ordinance to the council for consideration of adoption. Right now, we are tentatively scheduled to have that be considered on September 28th. We have sent what we are hoping is a final draft version to the DNR for their final review and comment, and are awaiting feedback from them as well. So again, I think we are, after several months of hard work, I think with everyone involved, we're getting close, and we're comfortable and happy with the draft ordinance that we have in place. So tonight's meeting, I just wanted to provide this group an update as to where the ordinance stands with some of the issues that we've discussed in the past and some of the feedback that has been provided to the Planning Commission, how some of that feedback has been incorporated. So I will be highlighting primarily those areas, those points of discussions, and some of the significant changes since this group last met. But if you do have any questions or want to look into some other areas as we go through, please feel free to let me know and do so, and we will pull that up and take a look at it. So from staff's perspective, we've got some updated information on a few of our definitions. We've got what we're hoping is final language related to nonconformities. We've got final answers on some of those land use questions we've had. We have our current final direction for lot area and width standards. We've got some information on controlled access lots, some refined language for vegetation management and stormwater management, as well as a new flexibility request for possible ordinary high water line variances in certain circumstances that stemmed from recent planning commission meetings. And then for those who have had an opportunity to review the draft ordinance, you also likely noted a number of Minnehaha Creek Watershed District additions. I have not called each and every one of those out in this presentation, but if there's any of those you'd like to discuss, just let me know. So I'll just kind of go through the list and jump in at any time. Impervious surface or lot coverage definition. As you know, we've had a little bit of discussion on that. Planning Commission, we dug into that a little bit deeper. A piece of the feedback from the DNR was, why do we consider swimming pools as an exception to impervious surface when they do in fact create runoff, especially if covered? And based on some of that discussion and some additional information, the Planning Commission has chosen to remove swimming pools as an exception to impervious surfaces. So upon adoption of this ordinance, a swimming pool would no longer, the area of a swimming pool would no longer be excluded from that calculation of the 25% impervious maximum. We've also talked a little bit about adding the definition for patios and detached decks. As you may recall, Victoria's current ordinance, the definition for deck is very specific to a structure that is attached to a building. So we were trying to figure out, how do we handle and govern those detached decks or paver or stone patios that are not attached to a building, while keeping our definitions consistent both within and outside of a shoreland district. So we've added an additional definition for patio or detached deck that explains what that structure is. Again, roofless outdoor space constructed from pavement, paver, stone, decking, or other comparable materials, and being clear that it's separate from and does not project from a wall. And where it really comes into play within a shoreland district is in those instances where it is extended more than 3 feet in height above the ground. It must meet setbacks of the principal structure or an accessory structure depending on its use, or water-oriented structure as well. And then patios or detached decks are included within the impervious surface calculation depending on the materials they are made of. If it is concrete, obviously it is an impervious surface. And then related to that, we also did have in our exceptions to impervious surface is a permeable patio or walkway, and we did not have a very good definition or any definition at all of what a permeable patio or walkway would be. So we've also added this definition into the ordinance that defines a permeable patio or walkway and explains how that would be governed, especially when, or particularly when, determining impervious surface calculations. So this was, I believe, the last meeting we had kind of a loose outline for this. We've further refined how to define these permeable patios and walkways through some additional feedback from the Watershed District and additional discussion with the Planning Commission. So we are defining these as any patio or walkway designed to facilitate the infiltration of water into the soil. It must be constructed in a way that allows water to channel or absorb in the underlying soil or into a special storage layer and not create runoff. And then we've got a number of conditions that they must meet, that they need to be installed per industry standards and conform to specifications outlined in the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's Stormwater Manual. This was the recommendation of the Watershed District to include that as a condition. A condition that they need to be constructed of a grid of pavers or stone with void spaces, and how those are filled, and include that permeable sublayer of at least 12 inches. That there needs to be a demonstration that the soils and site conditions are allowable to allow that to function properly. And then, as you'll recall, we had some discussion as to how big can these things get and still be considered impervious. And so we've right now landed on anything exceeding 2% of the total lot area. Not that you wouldn't be allowed to use a permeable surface to create those patios, but once you've exceeded 2% of that entire lot, anything in addition of that 2% would count as impervious towards that calculation. Just so you can't pave your entire backyard and say that it's impervious, because by nature, there is still some impervious action with these permeable walkways. One that we didn't talk about
Excuse
is,
me, one second,
go
going
ahead.
back to what you talked about with the detached decks.
yeah,
Can you clarify that again? How that is considered when you're looking at setbacks?
yes, so anything that extends more than 3 feet in height above the ground, and this again, that number was based on the DNR's ordinance and their feedback as we were working through this definition. So a at-grade rock or stone patio will not necessarily have to meet setbacks. It'll still, you'll have to work that into impervious depending on the materials, but if you've got a detached deck that is 3 feet or higher above the ground, you then need to either meet principal structure setback. It can constitute as an accessory structure, so if your detached deck is your accessory structure for the lot, and they can also be a water-oriented accessory structure.
Is that consistent then with the FEMA approaches to detached decks? Because detached decks are not looked at from a FEMA standpoint, as I understand it now, for setback requirements.
I'm not sure how this relates to the FEMA requirements specifically. As I mentioned, this was on the guidance from the DNR as to how to govern these types of things, but I'm not entirely sure how it relates specifically to the FEMA requirements.
I'm looking at that from the standpoint of what FEMA does for insurance on properties, and if there's damage due to floods and so forth, how they handle it. And it's my understanding that a detached deck is treated differently than an attached deck.
Okay,
And that a detached deck is not looked at as being part of the structure from an insurance standpoint. So that if there happens to be damage that comes about because of high water or those types of conditions, that they will not cover it with any insurance that they have if it's detached.
Are you concerned that the language in here might have some impact on that? Because it doesn't seem like it would.
It would have impact if you're inside the inside the setback requirements, and then you're mandated to have insurance, exactly what's covered, what not, and so forth. And I just wondered if there'd be any concerns for consistency within that.
I can certainly
The only impression
reference that.
is Setback requirement is more of an aesthetics thing than a,
If you're inside the high, what's considered to be the high water, the high water area within there, then there are restrictions as to what you can do from a construction standpoint. And then there's also the restrictions as to what insurance is going to cover what's considered to be part of the structure. So, I just looking at, it might be well for us to just check consistency with that.
Sure. Yep, I can cross-reference that with the FEMA requirements and make sure that we haven't created anything that conflicts or causes issues with that, with our language. All right, so moving on then to the definition of steep slopes. As I had mentioned, this is not something we discussed in much detail in our previous meeting, but it has been a topic of discussion in the last several planning commission meetings. Again, particularly based on feedback from the DNR related to the city's steep slope definition being at 18% and the DNR's model ordinance being at 12%. So, the city's current definition of steep slope did not trigger a steep slope until you hit an 18% grade, which is steeper than a 12% grade, which the DNR has in their model language. So their question to us is to why are we not considering anything between 12 and 18 as steep slope? So as part of this, I understood that the definition of steep slopes had been changed recently citywide in our city code prior to my arrival. So I had started doing a little bit of digging into previous meeting minutes and discussions and staff reports about why this definition had been changed. And there was some rationale and some things explained as to the 18%, is it related to the suitability for farming, and farming at an 18% slope was kind of the cutoff. So if and that's where you see a lot of the traditional tree stands on slopes, is on those 18% slopes. My understanding, and from what I've read and looked into, is that there was some controversy related to that change in the language. In addition to that changing to 18%, there was some additional very strict language on being able to do any sort of activity or tree clearing or anything on slopes 18% or higher. And that at the time when the council approved that, they were interested in revisiting it again in a future date to determine if it still made sense, or if we should be looking for a change. So through discussion with the planning commission and kind of rehashing some of these old conversations, we had a number of planning commissioners who were on the commission when this conversation happened a couple of years back. It was determined that we should look to revert back to our original definition of steep slopes, constituting those at 12% or higher, and looking to adjust our zoning language outside of the Shoreland ordinance that really spoke to what can and can't be done on those steep slopes. So based on those discussions, our proposal is again to revert the definition back to 12% and then amend our zoning code outside of the Shoreland ordinance so that both the shoreland and the non-shoreland areas are consistent on what can be done. And essentially, they would then be dictated, any tree removal would be dictated by the city's tree preservation and replacement ordinance. So, which requires a tree analysis, which requires replacement at certain percentages of trees removed, significant trees removed, et cetera. So this one is a little complicated. It's got some history to it. So I'll be happy to take any questions or provide any additional clarification that I'm able on this item.
I guess I'm curious as to a couple of things. One is, we also have a definition of a bluff somewhere, do we not?
Yes, and a bluff uses 18%.
Okay, so it seemed like somehow we converted steep slopes into bluff
Right.
for a while. And with regard to the tree preservation ordinance, does that have a distinction in the requirements for steep slopes versus flat land, or less than steep slopes?
The tree preservation ordinance does not specifically call out steep slopes, so it uses the same calculation regardless of the topography of the land when you're determining what replacement is needed when things are removed.
So what is the impact, or what are the restrictions that exist for steep slopes that don't exist elsewhere?
Sure. So clear cutting, and that's part of this section 3310, as well as part of the Shoreland ordinance. So I did not copy and paste that section. This is just the definition section, but within the Shoreland ordinance, there are restrictions for clear cutting. So it says steep slopes cannot be clear cut. So you can't come in and cut down all of the trees and then use the city's tree replacement calculation to say, I'm willing to replant elsewhere, but I'm cutting all these down. So clear cutting, so a complete removal of trees is prohibited. It also requires that when trees are removed, that perennial ground cover be retained and a maintenance monitoring plan is established. So that is in the Shoreland ordinance, and that is part of our proposal with updating this section 3310 to be consistent outside of Shoreland District on steep slopes as well. In addition to that, there would also be, and this is part of the Shoreland ordinance as well, a grading, filling, or erosion control permit that would be required when certain amounts of dirt are moved on those steep slopes. So those would also be in addition to the tree preservation and replacement ordinance.
I'm thinking it would be worthwhile to consider requiring any tree removal to be mitigated on the steep slope, as opposed to elsewhere, or
Replanting on the steep slope.
replanting on the slope. I'm wondering if you can work that in. I don't think anybody on the planning commission would object. Because that, in the Shoreland ordinance, elsewhere, it's not as significant, I think, but within the shoreland zone, if you're going to remove a lot of trees, the mitigation should be done on the steep slope.
Right. And this started because of our work with the Shoreland Ordinance, and we have adjusted the definition in the Shoreland Ordinance, which isn't as impactful as what's noted in the section 3310. It's really just changing the trigger of when it is. These additional ordinance changes, because we've got this section, we've got a few of our general definitions that are going to be needed to be changed. We are planning to bring those. Those will also need to have a public hearing as well. So steep slopes will have another opportunity for folks to provide input and further discussion when we look at actually changing outside of the Shoreland Ordinance. I'm hoping to bring that to the Planning Commission in early October. So we will have a little bit more discussion on steep slopes specifically, as well as some of the other changes within the zoning code that have kind of been predicated by the work we've been doing on the Shoreland Ordinance.
But are you now considering taking that change to the shoreline ordinance into the draft? That is, that the tree preservation requirements on a steep slope within the shoreland district would have to be mitigated on the steep slope?
And that would be the question, is whether that is within the Shoreland Ordinance or whether that's something that's within the Tree Preservation Ordinance, if it's that update's made in one of those places. So I've made a note of that. I'm gonna kind of look and see where that makes the most
There may be
sense.
some objection to requiring that outside of the
Right.
shoreline district and less so within.
Right,
So if it's gonna happen only in the shoreline district.
Just
it has to
that in
happen
this
as part of
ordinance.
This change.
right.
Marty, can I ask an additional question? So are there any other limitations or restrictions that occur within the shoreline ordinance by changing the slope from 12%, 18% to 12%?
No, yes and no. So there are a number of other items related to what you can and can't do on steep slopes within the Shoreland Ordinance. And actually, by changing this from 18 to 12 within the Shoreland Ordinance, as was recommended by the DNR, you are now triggering that on some less steep slopes. You're actually having some additional protection on slopes that maybe wouldn't qualify as a steep slope previously if you were looking at 18%. But if you are to, and I'm not sure if you have a copy of your draft ordinance in front of you, but if we go to, this is section, I need to remind myself of the section, that's the definition. Sorry, give me 1 minute here. You'd think I'd have this thing memorized by now, right?
I would think.
While Marty's looking, I guess, and if you would consider finding out if the group is on the same page with this, or raises any concerns here.
And what exactly are you?
I'm suggesting that the small change to the shoreline ordinance be made that specifies that tree removal for the tree preservation ordinance, the general tree preservation ordinance, on a steep slope within a shoreline zone be mitigated on the steep slope.
Right, and what I heard Marty say is that, that yes, he will make that change. It will just either be in this ordinance or in the tree.
Right, it doesn't matter to me which it's in, as long as it's
Right.
in one.
Mhm.
Right.
But the opportunity to put it in the shoreline ordinance will go away if they approve the shoreline ordinance without it, and then don't approve the change in the general zoning.
So were you just asking for our consensus?
Yeah,
with what we're saying?
absolutely, consensus here,
I would,
I think it's
I
a
would
good
say,
idea or a bad idea.
I would agree with it. With what
Yeah,
you're
I
saying.
do.
What's the objective? I guess that's my question.
the objective.
Making a recommendation, what's the objective of the recommendation?
The objective is to preserve the tree cover as much as possible on the steep slope, because the trees are the best defense against erosion from water running towards the lake and carrying sediment into the lake. The canopy protects from the rainfall, and the roots hold the soil and provide an environment for other things to grow underneath. And if we don't do this, the consequence is, per the tree preservation ordinance, it's perfectly legitimate to remove a significant number of trees on a steep slope and plant an equivalent, caliper equivalent, far away from the slope, farther away from the lake. And I see that as a detriment to water quality.
So, right, so this is just a question. So what if somebody replaced that tree with something that's equal or better from a erosion perspective? Would that be acceptable or not acceptable?
If it's on the same,
or is the issue the runoff and the erosion?
the issue is mostly the runoff and erosion. But again, if the trees are planted beyond the steep slope, they won't have the same beneficial impact as they would.
So-
Absolutely understand that.
And that's all I'm asking for is that the replacement occur on the steep slope as required. The tree preservation ordinance already spells out what you gotta do if you're gonna take out trees, what you gotta plant. It just doesn't specify where.
Right, and there is a indication in the tree preservation ordinance that says that if at all feasible or space allows, that tree replacement is supposed to take place within the vicinity of removal or on the same parcel. So I don't think that it's too much of a stretch to ask to have something similar for steep slopes, that again, when it is feasible and technically possible to replant any replacement trees, that they be put on the slope. If, again, if possible, if space allows them to go in.
What we're fighting with is there is a strong tendency for riparian owners to want to remove all the trees between their house and the lake, which definitely has a detrimental impact, especially if it's on a steep slope, and there tends to be a lot of steep slopes between houses and the lakes.
No, I totally understand the objective.
Okay.
So there's two potential objectives. One is to protect the trees, so that people can't take trees out of the property, and the second is to protect the water
Right.
by making sure that there's no erosion and that there's some technology, natural or unnatural, that's able to eliminate the risk or the potential for erosion if you remove the trees. And so what I'm trying to get at is, what is the issue? Is the issue that people remove the trees? Or is the issue that we worry about the runoff and the quality of the water in the lake? And so for me, if it's trees, the aesthetic part, I think it's, I don't know if that's within the scope of what this committee does, whether that's a planning commission challenge. But if it's from the impervious, if it's from the issue of erosion and water quality, then I think it's perfectly appropriate. And so what I'm trying to understand is what are we trying to accomplish?
I suspect there's a little of both. Again, the whole notion of setbacks and structure height limitations, et cetera, are pretty much aesthetics unless you get into the heights where a fire department can't reach them. The removal, the preservation of vegetation and tree canopies on the shore, between the shore and the houses, is part of that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm certainly not opposed to somebody needing to take out some trees or limb them so they can see the lake. And the notion that you can't clear cut is an attempt to prevent that worst case scenario. But I can envision, given the incentive people have to remove the trees between their house and the lake, that a common practice would be to remove all those trees and plant trees on the other side, between the house and the road.
Sure.
To mitigate it, and
Sure.
I don't see that provides the same benefit.
And Committee Member Guru, to your question about the how this is governed within the Shoreland Ordinance. So this is actually Section 22.8B in Vegetation Management, and it was a section that we were going to get to here in a few minutes, but we'll jump to it now since we're discussing it. I've pulled it up on the slide here. So this is the language that is currently in the draft ordinance. So it states that removal or alteration of vegetation must comply with the provisions of this section. except for vegetation alteration necessary for the construction of structures and sewage treatment systems under validly issued permits for these facilities, the construction of public roads and parking areas if consistent with other section of the ordinance, and agricultural uses consistent with other section of the ordinance. And then it goes into stating that clear cutting or intensive vegetation clearing in the shore and bluff impact zones and on steep slopes is prohibited. And then that clearing and trimming of trees and shrubs in the shore and bluff impact zones and on steep slopes is allowed pursuant to provisions of the tree preservation and replacement ordinance to provide a view from the water, from the principal dwelling, and to accommodate the placement of stairways and landings, picnic areas, etc. And then that it must, provided that the screening of structures, vehicles, and other facilities is viewed from the water, is not reduced, existing shading of water surfaces along tributaries is preserved, cutting debris or slash shall not be scattered, shall not be scattered and not mounded on the ground. Perennial ground cover is retained and a maintenance monitoring plan is established. So that was one of the additional more protective standards that was added, is that we'd want to require some sort of maintenance monitoring plan on these steep slopes when trees are removed. And then livestock watering areas, beaches, watercraft access areas are prohibited in those areas. And then also a note about fertilizer and pesticide runoff must be minimized through vegetation or topography or both. So those are the current vegetative guidelines that are within the draft ordinance right now.
So thanks, Marty. So if you went back to number 2, you said you can't clear cut, period. So what is the goal of this element of policy that we're discussing? If you can't clear cut in the first place, why do we need to have an additional ordinance that talks about if you clear cut, you can put the trees back?
Well, because so clear cut would be the complete removal. Let's say, for example, you have 20 trees on a steep slope. So by saying clear cutting is prohibited, you can't come in and cut down all 20 of those trees. You could potentially cut down 10, right? Say you're cutting down 10 of these 20 trees. That now gets factored into our tree preservation and replacement ordinance, which has a calculation. Okay, you've cut down 10 trees. Let's say one of them's dead, so it doesn't count towards the calculation, but 9 of them were significant trees. You've got now 45% or 47% or whatever that is of your significant trees have been removed. That is then what's plugged into that tree preservation ordinance that calculates the replacement caliper inches. And I think to committee members Fisher's point is, you've now, in a situation like that, you've got to replant X caliper inches. The preference would be to replant those in the area of the steep slope versus somewhere else on the property to mitigate that the tree removal.
And to clarify, you said that the tree preservation statute currently suggests that you replant in the proximity of the downed tree.
Yeah, I'm not sure on the exact verbiage, but in summary, yes, there's a condition in there that requests that it be planted within the area if possible. I'll confirm what that specific language is, but
I think that's
something
been
to that
interpreted in the
effect.
past to mean on the same lot as
Right.
some other development.
Right,
Which is a little weaker than I was hoping for.
right.
And if there was an objection to this, you could even back it off a little and say, okay, some percentage of the mitigation has to be on the steep slope.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
You bet. Any other questions on that? I'm gonna backtrack my slide here a little bit. So, moving on to the nonconformity section, and I'm actually gonna click out to the ordinance because this was gonna take me like 5 slides to copy and paste in here. If I can make it work.
Anyway, when I looked that over, it looked like you guys did a really good job on that.
No, thank you. Let's see if we can make that a little bigger so we can actually see it.
Thank you, Marty.
Got a magnifying glass. There you go.
And we are going down to 22.3H. All right, here we go. So, as you will recall, and I'll see if I can make that a little bit bigger here yet, if I can find my tools. Oh. Oops. There we go. So as you'll recall, when we've talked about these sections on nonconformities that are within the current Shoreland ordinance, to allow some additions of nonconforming properties, and as well as the tear down and rebuild of some properties that are currently nonconforming. There was feedback and discussion from the DNR about some additional protective standards being needed to offset those, that flexibility to allow those types of nonconformities. So we've taken that feedback and we've incorporated it into the definition here. So essentially what this clause says is that nonconformities are governed under, in the shoreland, are governed under this specific state statute. And then we've got all additions or expansions to the outside dimensions of existing nonconforming structures must meet the setback height and other requirements of this ordinance, and that any deviation from those requirements must be authorized by a variance with the following exceptions. So basically saying if you're not going to meet those standards, you need a variance unless, and this is the point of those additions or expansions to the outside dimensions of a nonconforming structure that are not in a shore impact zone, that those can be allowed without a variance as long as they are not further encroaching into the ordinary high water line setback. They're not increasing in height beyond 25 feet or the existing building height, whichever one is taller. They are adhering to the setback standards of the underlying zoning district as it refers to side yards or rear yards, so you're not allowed to encroach into what typically the side yard setbacks are 10 feet, rear yards are 30 feet, front yards are 30 feet as well. And then that they are not exceeding the allowable impervious surface standards. So essentially what this is meant to do is if someone's got a home on a large enough lot that is at 75 feet from the ordinary high water line versus what the code requires of 100 feet, they're able to do an addition onto that home that doesn't further encroach into the ordinary high water line. So it can't be a front yard addition, but potentially add on to the side or the rear as long as they're meeting these conditions. And that would then be able to be done without a variance. And then the
One question,
oh,
Marty.
go ahead.
It's a little unclear to me, but maybe it's just because I have the whole thing in front of me here, but point 3 here, adhere to additional setback requirements. Maybe that ought to be clarified to side yard and,
Just to be clear, sure.
because it's kind of vague as to what.
Because that's what we're referring to. We're referring to side, front, rear yard setbacks that are not necessarily dictated by the shoreland ordinance.
I'm assuming that the requirements for maximum impervious surface, I don't know if there's any other requirement in terms of the maximum footprint on a given lot size, but I assume all of that applies as normal.
Yeah, correct. There's not necessarily a footprint
I don't think
maximum, because it usually between the setbacks and the impervious surface,
Yeah.
that provides the limitation of making sure it's not too large of a home.
I
But
guess my question is, this doesn't automatically grant somebody approval to increase the size of their footprint and impervious surface beyond the current standard?
correct. And then there is also a request, and again, this was based on DNR feedback, that there be, if these are granted, they also need to submit a plan that includes some additional stormwater management initiatives that will be undertaken as part of that addition or expansion, and that they need to be approved by the city, installed and maintained. And this was, as we discussed, we didn't necessarily want to be super specific on what those can be, so rather we've provided some examples of reestablishing a natural riparian buffer, installation of rain gardens or catch basins or swales to reduce runoff or into a lake or creek, reduction of impervious surface on the property, so maybe making a driveway smaller, those types of things. Something would be required to help offset that additional size that's being created by that addition. So then the second piece of this nonconformity section is for the lots of record that are non-conforming and that will be removed or nearly removed, that they're currently non-conforming and would be basically a tear-down structure, that they may apply for a variance to maintain that existing non-conformity. So again, that's kind of the key component with this one, is that this one would need a variance, so it would need to go through the entire process to be approved. And they would also have to follow the additional conditions and considerations to even have that variance have a chance to be granted or approved. So one being that the setbacks of adjacent properties need to be considered. So if you've got a row of homes that are all non-conforming and this would push the other home 50 feet behind them, that would be part of the consideration as to whether or not a variance would be granted. Again, that the principal structure cannot encroach further into the ordinary high water line setback, and that no variance will be granted for a setback of less than 50 feet from the ordinary high water line. This letter C, the calculations, this is something that's carried over from our existing ordinance that essentially says that, and again, this is meant to limit the size of the structures, that depending on the number of feet you are non-conforming towards the setback, that will calculate to a reduction in height and as well as side yard setbacks, so you can't necessarily be as large as you could be without those restrictions. Again, we've included that the maximum building height and structure height shall not exceed 25 feet. That was something I think that this committee had recommended and the planning commission agreed with. And then same with the previous nonconformity, that prior to approval of a variance, that you need to submit a plan, including additional stormwater management initiatives.
Okay, I have a question in this part, because there's one nonconformance that I know we discussed some inclusion of, but I don't see mentioned. And that's the elevation piece above ordinary high water that puts you high enough above it to be able to do a construction. And if you have a foundation right now, let's say is 1 foot or maybe even 2 feet above the ordinary high water level, the present codes are looking at being 3 feet above that so that you're not getting water damage into basements and other things.
Are you suggesting that this variance process shouldn't allow a tear down to remain below that 3 foot limit?
Below that 3 foot.
Yeah.
Even if it's existing at 1, it needs to be at least 3.
Yeah. And that may mean that, in their construction, that they need to build it up. There are ways that FEMA and others allow you to build it up higher with materials that will not be water damaged.
And it will pass the water.
And it will pass the water through, if it happens. But I don't see mention of that elevation piece when we're talking about the ordinary high water level, and it is a significant part.
And I know and this may have just been an oversight on my part, because I know I had added some additional language related to the FEMA floodplains and other sections, so I'll re-look into that. That could have just been an oversight on my part.
I mean, I know what the critiques are in our area right now, because there were homes built in the 60s, and there were some blanket statements saying that they did not meet codes. Well, they met existing codes. Most of them are 3 feet or above 3 feet. But we do have a couple that are like 2.5 or 2 feet. And because we had extraordinary high water levels on the lake that exceeded the ordinary high water levels, then you're getting yourself into exactly what our, what gets paid for with insurance and other pieces to that whole thing. Were they legal under today's restrictions? So I'm just saying it should be in there somehow.
Do you think that should also apply to additions to a structure or just to a tear down? I'm thinking just a tear down probably makes more sense, because you're not gonna solve the problem if you.
You're not going to solve the problem. with
You
that.
can't, it would make no sense to require somebody to elevate the structure that's,
No, it doesn't. I mean,
okay.
I'm just saying, if you're trying to, give them the opportunity to build on an existing foundation, then
Right.
then we should have.
The
something
elevations
in there
need to be
try
what the
improve
current standards
elevation.
are. Gotcha.
Good point.
All right. Any other questions on nonconformities? Moving on to land uses, as was recommended by this committee to look into whether or not we could prohibit feedlot expansions and mining and those types of activities that had previously been noted as a conditional use. The answer was yes, we can prohibit them. I think the recommendation was to prohibit if we can, and the Planning Commission agreed with that. So the new feedlots, expansion of feedlots, forest management, land conversion, extractive and mining of minerals and peat are all considered non-allowed uses within a shoreline district.
Okay. To win.
If someone strikes gold on their property within the shoreline, they can always come and request a variance if they would like to mine gold on their property. Lot area and width standards, so again, nothing has,
Already, sorry to interrupt, can you just go back? Is that a significant issue today? I'm relatively new to the city, so in terms of having agricultural feedlots or the expansion of existing feedlots, is that
not within the current city limits. We have a couple of agricultural uses within shorelands in the township that potentially will be part of the city limits, that this could factor into in the future. But as we are today, no, it is not.
Yeah, that was the impetus for going there, was the inclusion of property into the city that potentially had this issue.
There are projected areas of annexation that already have farms and
But you're right, nobody's got a feedlot within the city today, on a lake.
Lot area and width standards, so nothing has changed with this since the last time we spoke. I just wanted to make note that based on discussion with the Planning Commission, the direction we are taking the ordinance to the council for their final feedback or approval on is that we would have two separate sets of standards. Essentially, the lakes that are currently within the city of Victoria would be grandfathered as the current standards of our natural environment, recreational development, and general environment lakes, and then any lakes annexed into the city after adoption would then go under those DNR standards, in addition to the flexibility request for non-riparian natural environment lakes. So that was the will of the Planning Commission. Again, we've had some informal discussion with City Council to kind of let them know this is the direction that we're taking this, and ultimately they'll be able to decide if they want to send it back to any of our groups to reassess, but that's the direction we're going currently.
I would ask that you add, I don't know how you do this, but not a change to the ordinance itself, but just comments explaining the rationale behind that. As I understand it, basically we're looking at a conflict between the attractiveness to developers wanting smaller lot sizes and preservation of the existing requirements for established shoreland neighborhoods, so that we don't see a big change. You don't have the situation where you might have if you changed the lot size requirements and building requirements on a city block from what they were to half of what they were, and people started tearing down houses and putting up twice as many houses, that would have a significant change to the character of that neighborhood, and that's the concern on the lake. So,
And that's exactly right, Committee Member Fisher.
if you could somehow incorporate that explanation of the conflict, and this is the resolution, to provide both
Certainly.
the protection of the existing neighborhoods and allow for the attractiveness to developers in new areas. outside the
Absolutely.
city.
All right, so moving on, controlled access lots. As you'll recall, we had some discussion on this as well. I know there were some varying thoughts and ideas, and I don't know that this group as a whole came to a consensus, but we did bring all of that feedback back to the Planning Commission to let them discuss as well. And the outcome of their discussion was to maintain the current DNR model language ordinance as to how those are calculated if more than 6 watercraft would be allowed on a controlled access lot, but adding that a variance would be needed to allow anything over 1. So since our current waterways ordinance states that there is 1 dock mooring place per property, if you are going to ask for a controlled access lot that would have more than that, it would need to get a variance to that waterways ordinance, and then would follow these guidelines depending on the number, and again, would have to go through the public engagement and review and discussion process if they were going to have more than 1.
Marty, can I ask, what would the city consider as reasonable criteria to grant a variance? What does the city think about in terms of moving from a single dock to a lot to granting up to 6 or more boats on, say, a typical lake?
Sure, and I.
How would you grant a variance?
Right, and I was not around when the discussion on the Waterford development took place, and I know they ended up with just one dock in that location, so I can't speak specifically to some of the history to those discussions, but I would envision that if a developer were going to come and say we want to allow up to 6, I think lot size would come in, area would come into play. I think lake traffic would come into play. I think public feedback would likely have a large impact on whether or not variance would be granted for something like that. Again, I'm speculating a little bit as to what some of those considerations would be, but in my mind, those are the ones that jump to the forefront.
So if I'm reading this correctly, the standard is 1, and then something happens between 1 and 6, and then something happens for the storage of more than 6. Are those, am I reading?
Yes, yep, so our current ordinance says 1 per property. The DNR's model ordinance on controlled access lots says that a controlled access lot has to be the same size as whatever a riparian lot would be in that development, so whatever the minimum are. And from the DNR's standpoint, you can have up to 6 boats moored on that size property. If you're gonna go more than 6, you now have to increase the size of that controlled access lot proportionately to those numbers. But because we typically our ordinance only allows 1 per property, anything over 1 would require a variance.
I'm wondering if there's any way to include some guidelines here. I think to your point, without them, it's kind of arbitrary. And I think we talked about this earlier in a previous meeting, but on a natural environment lake, the guidelines should be very stringent. And on a recreational development lake, it should be more stringent than a general development lake. Something like, there has to be an extraordinary reason to go beyond 1 on a natural environment lake, and the going beyond 2 on a recreational development lake would require some pretty strong reasoning, and the 6 might apply on a general development lake. Something along that lines, as a guideline, not as a requirement, but just so that when a future planning commission or council has a project before them, they have something to lean on other than personal opinion.
Do we have something in our definitions of the different lake types, though, that maybe does that already, that would say a natural development lake is a lake that, you have to have a larger lot size, it's more protected, that's already kind of there in the definitions?
There's nothing there that relates to the guideline for the number of docks or boats.
Yeah, not necessarily directly related to the controlled access lot. The lot size, how large that controlled access lot needs to be, would be dictated by the riparian lot size of those specific lakes. So, the natural environment lakes that have the larger, lot area would, although I think in our current lakes, we're all at, pretty comparable among those, but, it would be dictated on what size that lot needs to be, but outside of that, it, wouldn't have any additional guidance.
The other thing that I think would make sense, but I don't know how to make it specific enough, is that a consideration should be what is the total riparian frontage of the project. If it's, if it's one lot riparian and wide, and is being fed by 40 acres of high-density housing, that's a completely different scenario than if it's like Waterford, where it was 5 lots wide to begin with. Again, I think that kind of stuff has to go in as a guideline. There's no way to make a specific issue out of it, but to give the future planning commission and city council something to lean on. I got one other comment on this issue. Yeah, well, I want to address that, because this is a different thing, so.
Yeah, I mean, that's just a question, right? So we built Waterford, I understand there's some history to that. You proceed your time here at Marty, and I haven't had a chance to go look at the rich conversation, I'm sure, that went on around the development of that property. It created, I assume, some degree of precedence for the city, right? And it's thinking of what they would allow and what they wouldn't allow. That's not very clear, but I think it would be very difficult today to explain to somebody, someone who buys a property on the lake, someone who's sitting on the lake, to explain to them what this ordinance does and does not allow people to do, right? So the kinds of guidelines, the kinds of the principles around how they would determine this, I think it would be really helpful for us to put more meat on the bone, so to speak, if that's possible, and I don't know within the administration, how we administrate the city, whether guidelines are acceptable. But it seems awfully loose to me, particularly when we're talking about some of the recreational lakes, some of the natural lakes. I think the larger lakes, it may have a very different impact in terms of the size of the water body. But the concept of putting 6 or more boats on a small recreational lake, not understanding what the guidelines would be for a potential buyer of one of these lots, for somebody who's considering buying one of these lots, to understand what is their life going to look like on the lake. Right? So you add 6 or more boats to a lake that only ever has 3 boats on it, making a significant change. And it's unclear to me, the public participation piece, just how much emphasis the city has on that relative to, say, the development of a piece of property. So I think
Right.
it feels a little uncomfortable to me.
Yep, no, that's absolutely fair, and I agree that, having guidelines for these types of things is always helpful, because it does at least give planning commissioners and city council members a path to kind of work from. There are, and it's not specifically related to this, but just in general, there are some specific guidelines as to when a variance can be granted for anything within our city code. One of them being that it cannot be a detriment to the neighborhood or the characteristics of a neighborhood or area. So I think absolutely, just in general, even without any additional language in here, that is certainly a large component and consideration when looking at variances. And at all times, the applicant for a variance has to demonstrate how they will meet those criteria for variance. Again, how they will not be a detriment, why they won't be a detriment, those sort of things. So there are some criteria for a variance just in general, but I agree, having some more specific guideline for this specific type of variance would be helpful.
Especially given the turnover we have in the city.
Right.
And Marty, what I was kind of trying to get at too is, I think if we could define the different lakes, if we could state the philosophy behind what is a natural development lake, that we want it to stay natural, to preserve you know, the habitat, to have lower lake use, to have larger lots, have that in the definition, so when they go to look at a variance, they can see what the difference is between that, not just the lot sizes, but what is the philosophy that makes this a natural development lake besides, you know, it's not Lake Minnetonka.
Yeah, why did we do something different?
Right, why do we categorize these differently, and why do we want to keep this, you know, different? What is different about this? And that's a way to get to those standards.
Yeah, very good.
Just to put a pin in this, so if there were to be guidelines, what part of the administration would follow those guidelines? Would that be the Lakes and Water Committee, would that be a subcommittee, would that be, is that a decision made elsewhere?
What part would what? Well,
If someone was to develop guidelines,
yes.
who develops those guidelines? Is it the Lakes and Water Committee, is it the Planning Commission, is it some other part of the administration of the city? I just don't understand who would do that.
Right, I mean, I think if it's something that we want to include within this ordinance, specifically codify as part of the ordinance, it would likely be something that staff would bring to this body and or the planning commission for consideration. If it was something, again, just a, not necessarily codified, but more of a guidelines, this is how we're going to consider what we're going to consider when we're looking at these types of things that can then be adopted by the planning commission as they're holding these public hearings. I think that could certainly be something that's done, you know, workshopped with a group like this to kind of talk through what those things could or couldn't be. Ultimately, again, as the planning commission is that board of appeals and adjustments, they would be the ones who would have to adopt those guidelines. So I think it really depends on how one were to go about wanting to incorporate them.
Again, I think a big part of that concept is just getting down on paper somewhere that somebody can refer back to is, you know, what was the thought at the time? And again, I don't see it as being something so critical that needs to be spelled out as this is the limit. But something more along the lines of this is the expectation.
Right, and maybe to your point, committee member Guru, maybe this is a good work plan item for this group is after the ordinance gets adopted, we take a deeper look in some of these things where we're granting variances or variances are allowed, or where there maybe is a little more loose interpretation. We could help develop some guidelines that could then be presented to the planning commission and council to use, you know, not necessarily codified, but at least some guidelines, recommended guidelines when you're looking at these types of things.
Sounds like a good idea, but I know that the planning commission members expressed several times a desire for increased flexibility. And the only issue I've ever had with increased flexibility is the misuse of that flexibility. And again, at times in the past, it's come down to very arbitrary consideration given to the use of flexibility to provide what a developer happens to want. And inevitably that creates some conflict, and if there's there's nothing to work from, the planning commission and the city council are kind of in a position where they can't really deny something.
Right.
There's no basis for it.
So just to clarify my position here, right, I agree with the other member here that this does not raise to the level of being codified. I just understand that administration of that would be difficult. But I do think that your recommendation that we have some kind of committee, some kind of discussion, workshop, however you want to describe it, to try to create the spirit of this meeting, right? The spirit of what we're trying to accomplish here within the Lakes and Waters Committee around controlled access lots. I think that would be useful.
And as Marty said, there may be a few other.
There may be some other items too within the ordinance that could all be kind of pulled together and.
Okay, just for what it's worth, on the Waterford Landing thing, since you weren't involved, the decision to limit to one dock was based on the potential impact of the 32 or 33 households relative to the size of the frontage. In other words, it was intended to have a similar impact as a single family on,
Right.
on a lot, and then they had room for four of those, so it would then to reduce the impact to about the level of 4 family-owned watercraft. And part of the reason behind that, or part of the direction came from the fact that in their case, it was a community watercraft shared by all of the homeowners versus individual homeowners keeping their own boat on a dock. The impact there is if you have 5 of the 30 homeowners have rights to keep a boat on the lake, and there's 5 lots of space, then that's an equivalent use. But if you have 30 people that could share a boat, that one boat becomes, 15 boats.
Right, could be used multiple times per day and, right.
So anyway, the other point that I wanted to bring up, we talked about this, but I see it hasn't made it in there. I would sure like to see something that requires the community access lot to be what's the right word? Adjacent to, connected to, whatever, the development as opposed to remote. I think the notion of a remote access, community access lot is problematic.
All right, and I thought we had determined that that was addressed.
That's not contingent, it's something else, like, there's a word and I can't think what it is.
Let me,
But
So I just want to clarify that. So what you're saying is, so someone could build a subdivision somewhere within the city limits and buy a public access lot, and they're supposed to be 5 miles from the lake, 10 miles from the lake?
right, I think that's not the way to go.
So a direct connection to the development.
Yeah.
so currently the language that's in there says that the lot must be jointly owned by all purchasers of lots in the subdivision or by all purchasers of non-riparian lots in the subdivision who are provided riparian access rights on the access lot. So I think the intent is that it needs to be part of that subdivision,
It
right?
doesn't
So,
say that right now.
so maybe it's just some modification to this 22 6C.
I mean, you could.
3C.
meet that requirement with a development on the south side of Highway 5. for a community
Contiguous,
access
I
lot.
think is the word you're looking for. Contiguous? Contiguous with
That
the,
is the word.
Yeah.
I knew it was a word.
Yep.
Yes.
So- yeah, that I think is just a little bit of added verbiage to this
Yeah, I think
letter
it's
C
simple
here.
addition, but we talked about it and it just never showed up.
Yep.
All right. Anything else with controlled access lots? Just about to the end here, we already talked about vegetation management, so we'll jump over to stormwater management. I did copy and paste the entire section into the slide here, just in case you wanted to take a look at it. One of the, some of the discussion was making sure that any stormwater that's management that's done is meeting the current and modern day standards. And we did include in letter D here that any stormwater management, it needs to be consistent with local watershed district or watershed management organization's stormwater rules and the city's MS4 requirements. So that was a new addition to the DNR language on the stormwater standards. And then the other piece of this again is just the maximum impervious surface coverage, 25% for all residential zoning districts and 80% in our central business district.
Okay, good. I don't know if I should go first because I'm always going first.
Well, the one piece that, where have we included the ongoing management of that stormwater system that's put in?
Right,
We're
and
putting
I,
the standards in for how it's to be constructed,
Yeah,
who is to own it, maintain it, and is responsible for.
right, and we had discussed this again, both internally and with the planning commission. I'm not sure if that is necessarily a codified requirement as to who continues to maintain ownership, more so than it is a internal operations and an administrative piece. So I do not have a good answer to that right now. It is not in the ordinance to be codified. It would be handled internally between Public Works and Community Development and Engineering staff to determine what the policy would be, but not necessarily within
Well, we've
code.
had a mixed policy. That's where
Yeah.
part of the problem comes.
And shouldn't there really be something in there that lays out if the homeowners association or whatever doesn't maintain the improvements per the, per their agreement, that the city has the right to come in and do it and charge them for it or something? I mean,
Yeah, if it's set up.
so you can't ignore it because that's the usual.
If the city owns it, then,
Yeah, then they're on the hook for,
then they're on the hook, and then you have the problem that we do in present places for who actually is budgeting to handle it
Yeah.
and do it that way. And then the second part is if you've designated it to a homeowners association or whatever for that development, then how do you hold them accountable and what do you do in making sure that it is maintained? Because the biggest thing is that we have effective maintenance of the stormwater system, so we don't have damages and other things coming as a result of high water. So,
yeah, something. Couple other things that kind of related to this. One is, I don't know if you remember, but Dick made a pretty valid point a long time ago about phase developments. And I don't see anything in here about that.
I'm sorry, what was that?
The issue was, when a phase development is put in place, let's say you're doing a PUD, let's say, for instance, pretend that Waterford was going to be done in 3 stages. There's nothing that precludes them or requires them to manage the erosion from the undeveloped portion. And that's particularly an issue if that undeveloped portion was cropland and is no longer planted. But I think you can be more general than that. Just in a phase development, I think there should be, if it's got any impact on a shoreline zone or any part of a shoreline zone, the phase development needs to maintain appropriate erosion control on the portion that's not being developed in the future phases.
Yeah, yep.
That just didn't get in here. And
what,
think that's
the recommended approach that I had made during earlier discussions was that, first of all, let's be realistic that we have farm property and so forth that we've got as planned annexations, that when you bring that farm property in, if you're expecting it to become residential development or commercial development, the developer who's coming in is in likelihood going to do that in a phased approach. The issue that you can run into is that you negotiate with that developer on how you're gonna handle stormwater and everything, but they're not interested in talking about anything that's other than the active phase of development. And they may own the entire property. And so you can reach an agreement with them quite easily. They're used to reaching an agreement on the property that they're actively developing. But the property that's just sitting there that may be farmland, that you can't force them to put crops on that, back on that what was priorly farmland. And so what you can run into is a very severe erosion problem from the property that's not being actively developed that they own. So my recommendation was that at the time you change zoning for somebody so that they can purchase those lots, that that's when you impose the situation that if you're going to develop it, you must manage the entire property from an erosion and stormwater standpoint. Even though you may only be actively developing a portion of it. And that, then at the point that they complete development and hand it off, well, then you can do something different, whether you're gonna hand it off to the home association or you're gonna take charge of it from a city standpoint and other things. And make that decision as to how you're gonna manage it.
And I'm sorry.
Following the development, so.
Right, and I had been kind of buzzing through here because I think I have a section where I think that makes sense under 22.8C under grading and filling, which I think should be grading, filling, and erosion control. That heading should be updated a little bit. We've got permit requirements for those types of permits. I think adding in a letter C here that an erosion control permit is required for an entire property.
Dick's got a good
Plan for phase
It would
development.
be rezoning it.
Yeah, I think the trigger point is that I'm gonna rezone it from agricultural, because now the existing owner sits there, you know, the previous owner sits there with the responsibility to farm it and take care of erosion, but the minute it changes to something else,
Right.
there's the opportunity to come back in and to put the regulations in as to how we're gonna transition that management.
Yep. Yeah, I think I can get that added in right here.
And the last point I got, which is, I think ties into stormwater management particularly, but I'm thinking specifically in terms of PUD now. I think the section on PUD needs to emphasize the requirement for any exceptions to the requirements that are granted to a developer under a PUD. Require that the developer show, prove that that's what he's doing is going to provide equal or better water quality, water management than following the rules. I think you could craft a statement almost to that, that pretty clearly states that. I know that was kind of the intent, but it's not in there. And again, if you have that requirement for them to prove, they have to have some engineering analysis or whatever, that what they're proposing is good or better is what you get if you didn't grant them flexibility. I understand the need for flexibility, but flexibility should not mean circumventing the requirements for the convenience of the developer. It should be a means to do a more efficient development or a more appropriate development, but still meet the underlying.
And you don't think that's what 2210C states?
Well, tell me what 2210C states,
It
because I don't have it.
states,
I looked through and tried to find
Yeah.
it and didn't see it.
I'll let
so
you
maybe I
read it.
missed 2210C, processing of RSPUDs. Residential planning developments in the Shoreland district must comply with the provisions of this section in addition to the standards of city zoning and subdivision regulations. When there is a conflict in requirements, the more stringent, no, that does not say that. What this says is that if the development is going to, the requirements of development are a combination of requirements outside the shoreline district and inside. And it's saying that whichever is more stringent is to be applied. That's all that's saying.
and you want it to say that it still has to comply with,
I wanted to say that the whatever.
By putting in a PUD, you cannot circumvent the
The effectiveness of the.
effectiveness of what was there for a residential or whatever it was.
Yeah.
You know, be
And I'm
done.
wondering,
Equal to or better than.
Equivalent or better, yeah.
And what you would get meeting the standards from a perspective of runoff,
Outside of
water
it,
quality, et
right.
cetera.
and I'm wondering if that could be just an enhancement of 2210A, the purpose of,
That works for me.
Residential
Again, I just want
PUD.
something in there that
so we've got,
makes that requirement clear.
right,
Well, it also gives teeth to the planning commission that's doing a review of this PUD, because all of a sudden, now at least I have measurable standards
Yep.
or metrics that we had in place that we can now say, okay, what would provide equivalent?
yeah, I think that's the place for that.
Okay.
All right,
And again, if you can manage it, I think it would be very desirable for it to require some kind of engineering proof.
right.
Third party approval
Right.
by,
I don't know if I want to get that specific, but it shouldn't be possible. I think it's gonna, it's gotta have some basis in measurable performance.
What companies?
Yeah, and that's, yeah. All I can tell you is, I actually pushed the same exact thing through the watershed district when I was president there. Originally, they had a very prescriptive requirement for stormwater ponds, and they kept running into, well, that doesn't work here, we need more flexibility. And what we came up with is, you can do almost anything you know, if you meet the requirements exactly, that takes care of it. But if you want to do something that deviates from the requirements, then you have to show that the performance is going to be equal to or better than what the requirements would have generated. So you might even want to talk to them about what
Yeah.
language they got, because I know they wrestled with it for a while. And I think they're pretty happy with what they got.
Excellent. Anything else with stormwater? All right, I think the last piece then, and again, this is something new from our previous meeting, is in addition to provide some guidelines to allow for a setback from the ordinary high water line variance. This resulted from some public feedback from a property owner and their representatives, the Meat Cutters property down south of Marsh Lake, and the unique challenges they are facing with that property and its topography and dimensions, and being constricted by the right-of-way, Marsh Lake Road, and the setbacks of the Marsh Lake, and being a natural environment lake. So they had asked the Planning Commission to consider having some sort of process where a variance could be granted to those setbacks under some very unique and conditioned circumstances. So what you're seeing here on the screen is what we came up with after doing a little bit of research to comparable variance language and some discussion. And essentially, the Planning Commission and Council could consider a variance as long as the minimum structure setback from the high water line is not reduced more than 25%. So you're putting a limitation on how much that high water line can be reduced. And that's also keeping you out of the shore impact zone, because as you'll recall, the shore impact zone starts at 50%. That the setback shall not adversely impact views of the shoreline or lake for adjacent neighboring properties. So if that's, again, it's going to be taking those properties into consideration. That it will need to be based upon specific need or circumstances that is unique to the property in question, and which, if approved, shall not set a precedent contrary to the intent of the ordinance. So again, you need to demonstrate why this specific piece of property would need to have some flexibility with that setback. Again, a shoreland impact plan would need to be submitted and approved. That the shore impact zone abutting any of the properties with reduced setbacks must be preserved and maintained. So that would be your 50% of the setback to the lake would need to be preserved as a natural buffer by using deed restrictions, covenants, etc. And then in addition, if you are to get that setback variance, you would then no longer be eligible for tier 1 bonus density in a PUD. So you'd have to go with whatever the straight density in the PUD would be, and not be allowed that bonus density, since you will be closer to the lake than what the
Tier 1.
setbacks would provide for.
Yeah, I really like this. I think it was well thought out. And pretty much solves the issue, assuming that it does actually solve the problem that the meat cutters have. The only comment I have on it is, it's pretty clear that you can't go beyond 25%. There's my concern here is that 25% may be taken as that's the norm. And if there's some way to indicate that the reduction will be only the amount needed to solve the problem, and it just doesn't automatically go to 25%, that would be desirable. But
Yeah, and
I have
that
no clue how to write that, so I'm not
Right.
sure.
right, and that's always a challenge with these types of variance or ordinance language. I use the downtown parking as an example. So the downtown parking ordinance allows for up to 50% reduction in whatever the parking requirements are, and most of the time the starting point is that 50%. So I totally get what you're saying, but my anticipation is that would likely be the starting point, and it would have to be worked through, but we can certainly look to see if there's some other language that can be provided.
Okay, again, I'm going to say another aspect of that's got to be the vertical aspect. The minute you're getting closer to the water, you're less likely to have the elevation that you may need for doing some of the structure. Making sure that there's adequate elevation in that piece as well.
Anything else with this one? That concludes my presentation, so I'd be happy to take any questions on any other parts of the ordinance or.
Yeah, I may be picky, but I'd like to go back to page 11, or 10 and 11.
In the ordinance
With
itself?
the lakes, yeah, with the lake numbers and the tributary pieces, some of those legal descriptions.
Oh, by the way, I don't know if you listened to the last planning commission meeting, but there was a desire by one of the members to consider, as the DNR apparently does, Sunny to be actually officially part of Zumbra.
Yes, it is officially a partner, so,
Yeah, according to the DNR, it is, yes.
yes, it is.
And they're the official designator.
They're the official designator, and it is listed that way on their site.
Yeah.
The other piece to that is, it means that the causeway that separates the two bays is a cross-water barrier,
Yes.
which is now an illegal structure, which, based on the laws, the way they were rewritten in the 70s. So there's a number of aspects, but it comes into play right here on this piece too, on pages 10 and 11, when you're looking at the tributaries and where they run and some of the definitions here. You said you had this reviewed. There's
Yes.
notes in here from the watershed district.
Yes.
I find it quite interesting because if you look at Zumbra, which is, yes, they do have the two bays separated here, and in some cases, there's a little bit of a reference to both of them being
Where are you in the, Ann and I are kind of digging through your.
it's in 3.1, it's on page
3.1, okay.
12, on the document itself that I have.
On page 12?
Yeah, it's section 22.4, classifications.
Yep, and
land
then-
use.
I got 3,
And then it lists under 3, the definitions under what is a recreational development lake, right?
Yep,
And you see Auburn as an example, the top one there,
right,
which is 1044.
yes.
And then the very last one, which happened to go to the next page,
Zumbra.
is Zumbra, which is 1041.
And,
And then you go down lower, which is under the natural environment,
and there's Sunny.
and there's Sunny as 10134P. Okay? Now, the next part underneath that is where I'm also confused, is because if I look at the tributary pieces here under 4A, and then sub-item 3, it says outlet from Zumbra Lake and wetlands, including Sunny Lake, which is fine, okay, that's where we're rolled together, to the northwest side of Lake Steiger. Well, guess what? There are wetlands that come from from the Sunny, that will go back and connect into Steiger, but the main runoff goes down to Lake Auburn, and that's not even mentioned.
That's the culvert you had to clean out, or the.
That's the culvert situations where you've got the outlet out of Sunny going to the outlet, going into the culvert that goes into the east side of Auburn, which is 1041. So it's not accurate, and I'll be happy to work with you offline on it, but that's
Sure, and
what
I
I'm
can-
saying is that becomes a problem, and maybe just under 3 that could be under sub-item 3 there, where it says outlook from Lake Zumbra and wetlands, including Sunny Lake. It says to the northwest side of Lake Steiger, okay, but in which there are wetlands and things that do make that connection. That was there years ago, but the primary one is coming to go down to Lake Auburn. It's in
Was
41.
that natural, the connection to Lake Auburn, or was that just?
It was there as well. That also was a wetland that flowed across.
Okay.
But when they put in the bike trails, they kind of cut off the wetlands that flowed
Yeah.
more vigorously into Steiger, and have encouraged it when they put the culvert in coming out of the end of Sunny
Okay.
They actually built an embankment and cut in a channel.
So there is a man-made aspect to it.
So there's a man-made aspect to it, and that now comes down, okay, and comes into Lake Auburn. So this does not accurately reflect what's going on, and I was kind of waiting to see what would come back from the watershed district, because we've had ongoing arguments with them about this piece of it. for quite
So the legal descriptions were what were provided to us from the DNR, which were then also sent to the watershed district for review. I will be perfectly honest with you, it is a little beyond my expertise, so I am relying on
The legal
their
description here is
expertise.
quite interesting to me, because we have had the present DNR tell us that there never was a connection to Steiger.
Okay.
And yet, we can physically see it, and we've marched back through the woods and marched back there and found old culverts and everything else that were in place. And a lot of history that says that was one of the connections. And there have been modifications, is what went on with the park and bike trails and all kinds of other things. And now the primary connection is the one that comes down into Auburn.
Now, you realize, of
It's
course,
also there.
by considering Sunny to be part of Zumbra and under the same classification as recreational development means that the limitations and protections offered for natural environment lakes no longer exist for Sunny. That's probably a moot point, given that it's all owned by the park.
The outside shoreline of it is, but what's happened since then is that it's not navigatable back and forth between the two existing bays of the
Yeah.
lake. And it also, there are restrictions on what happens with fish migrations and other things, the natural fish migrations between the bays. So there's a lot of different aspects of it to bring into play. But you could still look at it as trying to protect that bay as much as possible under the, and list it as a bay. I don't know. That's for, I just would like to see them
I
work
will,
out the legal aspect of that
I
and
will
ask the
seek some
question.
additional clarification from the DNR on
Is
that.
there a different number assigned?
It's a
from the
different
DNR?
number assigned to the Sunny Bay as versus the,
Is that correct? Or is that?
the DNR assigns it the way they want to, based on what they're doing, and if they wanna treat that as a protected bay, all right, that was normally linked and is all part of one lake, that's still a call that they're gonna have to make. And, we could argue it a lot of different ways. But the fact that the actual watershed, if you will, from Zumbra, the primary watershed, does go down into Auburn at this point in time.
Yeah.
And then the connection that goes to Steiger actually helps to preserve some very special woodlands and what goes on with the types of trees and so forth they have back in that woodland area, which they consider something that they want to protect. So, it's, good luck.
Yeah, thank you.
Have fun with it, in other words.
Hey, Marty,
Yeah.
just one point of clarification that I was unclear on the discussion of the vegetation management section. I mean, was a recommendation or an amendment made by one of the council members? Did we make that amendment? Did we not make that amendment? I'm just unclear.
For vegetation management, okay,
There was a recommendation or a suggestion that the trees must be planted back on the slope. And I wasn't sure whether or not that was a recommendation and we just talked about it, or whether or not that was adopted in.
Yeah,
as a
so-
requirement.
yep, so we just talked about that this evening, I was going to, yep.
But I'm not- Did we approve that and add that? Did we debate?
So
it?
my
Consensus around it?
Yeah, so my intention is that some of these additional pieces, I am going to red line into the document and take to the planning commission meeting at their next meeting. Ultimately, they will determine what they want to accept or not accept, but I'm going to take all of it, and I've made some pretty detailed notes on areas where, and specific areas where I'm planning to do some of that. So I'll be presenting that all to the planning commission at their next meeting. That's my intention anyway, if that's the intention of the committee.
We don't actually get to decide anything.
And is that the meeting on the 15th of September?
Yes, that's next week, yep.
Okay, and then it goes to the council on the 28th is the plan.
Right now, again, barring any major concerns from the DNR. We're awaiting DNR feedback, so if we come back with a lot of items from the DNR that need to be readdressed, that will again kick that timeline down the trail a little bit, but barring no major concerns from them, then yes.
Okay, very
You
good.
know, I might give you something to put in your back pocket for this particular discussion. This categorization has to do with shoreland classifications, okay? So what they're basically saying is the shoreland within the sunny bay of the lake, they consider to be one,
Right.
versus the shoreland on the, you know, on the other parts of the lake, which is considered to be Zumbro, is a different part of that. You know, their numbers work, but when you start to look at the watershed aspect of it, with, you know, what you're calling the tributaries down in that part 4, then that's where they need to add this thing going to cover.
Okay.
I think that would
Good
probably pretty clear, they still consider it to be a single lake, but they're treating the shoreline different on one bay than they are
On the other.
in terms of classifications.
Any other final points, questions? No? Staff, anything else?
Nothing else from staff?
Great. Well, thank you, Marty and staff and the Planning Commission and whoever else has worked on this. I think it really is coming together, and I think it's going to be a good addition to our city ordinances. So moving on to our agenda, we have miscellaneous. Anyone have any miscellaneous items?
None from
I can
staff.
add one item, just as a commentary. Because of the erosion along Highway 7 on the north side of Lake Zumbro, the MnDOT actually accelerated their project of improvement of Highway 7, and at the beginning of this month, closed the eastbound lanes, basically, you know, that run along Highway 7, and have detoured the traffic that's eastbound, like coming out of St. Bonnie on 7, down 11, and across 5 here in town, and then if you want to get back up to 7 and along 41. So, and that will be closed for a couple months. So you can go westbound, but you can't go eastbound, and they moved that project up because it had eroded
It was
more severely. It was supposed to be next year, but they moved that project up.
I got worried they're gonna lose the road.
Yeah, so it is underway at this point in time, and just for the edification of this committee, that's, you know, something that's new and ongoing.
Very good. Thanks for the update. If there's nothing else, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn?
Second?
Second?
All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, it's unanimous. We're adjourned. Thank you.